The next law that I would like to spend a few minutes talking to you about is the Fair Debt Collection Practices. Now, hopefully, none of you will get into a situation where you have to use the provisions in this act, because if you do, that means that you've probably got into a bad situation. You've got a debt, somebody's trying to collect on that debt, and you're dealing with the circumstances there. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act is designed to eliminate abuse, deception, and unfair debt collection practices. The Code of Conduct for debt collectors exists within this act, and it basically says that they can't use harassing or abusive behaviors. They can't engage in misleading tactics. Now, some of that is probably in the eye of the beholder. Making a phone call to try and collect a debt isn't in and of itself a harassing act. Using foul language, calling in the middle of the night, calling your employer, making threats, these sorts of things would be harassing and abusive. But the mere pursuit of a legitimate debt is not in and itself harassing. There are still some things you can do to deal with it, though. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act establishes rights for the consumer, and it establishes penalties for those who would violate the act. I believe it's $1,000 per violation. So if there are charges or if there are issues that you have under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, there are remedies within the legal system to use. This applies to consumer debt only. So if you have a home business or you have any sort of other business where you're engaged in a commercial enterprise, however large or small it may be, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act doesn't apply to you. We are talking about consumer debt, and that's where this stuff applies. There is a rule in there that a debt collector can only contact you between the hours of 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. They may not contact you at your place of employment. And if you happen to be represented by a lawyer, they have to make communications through that lawyer and cannot make contact with you. You do have the ability, under the Act, to stop them from calling you. Even if you owe the debt, even if it's a legitimate debt, you can, in writing, send a letter to the debt collector saying, please stop. Please stop contacting me. Now, again, there's something important to understand about that. Just because the law gives you this remedy, just because the law says you can send a letter and you can make the phone call stop, that does not mean that you don't owe the debt. If you owe the debt and you don't pay it, there can be consequences for that. And if there is no dialogue going on with the company to which you owe the debt, then they may very well have no other recourse than to consider filing a lawsuit against you, and they may do that. They may pursue other legal process to force you to pay. They will get a money judgment against you and perhaps seek a garnishment of wages or something along those lines in order to get the debt repaid. In the military, it may be possible for a creditor to contact military authorities. Now, they sometimes do that. There's a little difficulty with the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act about contacting an employer, so that you have to mix that into the soup here. But it nonetheless does happen that these creditors will sometimes contact military authorities seeking the debt. And it's been my experience that command authorities in the military will give some attention to that from time to time because they are concerned about the impression that it creates as it relates to the military community. If it's known in the local community that there's a lot of soldiers, sailors, and airmen out there carrying bad debts, then that kind of gives a black eye to the military. It's not considered to be consistent with good order and discipline in the military, and it doesn't engender the kind of trust in the military that the civilian population is entitled to have. So that's why the military sometimes comes down pretty hard on this stuff, because there is an idea that the military personnel should be above it and should be disciplined enough to take care of their debts. And as I said, talked about before, there can even be criminal consequences for it. So under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, you can stop the phone calls by sending the letter, but that doesn't mean you don't owe the debt. So be careful about that and make sure you take care of the debt to the best extent of your abilities, even if you're stopping the pursuit of the collection agency.